that are related
David Katz
to.
is ready, everyone.
All right, let's ask David Katz. It is always an effort, and it always adds a little drama for us as to how he's going to join, when he's going to join, whether he's going to join. But the audience looks forward to him joining, as do I. He's the former assistant U.S. attorney and prosecutor for the feds. He knows the law. Now he's defending people. He's defense attorney. He is, I think, the legal ninja is what I call him. David Katz, everyone.
Great to be with you, Mark, Kim. And it's
Yes,
not
sir.
whether I join. I always manage to join. But yes, there is sometimes some drama, whether it's audio, video from New York. But I always join.
Yes, it's true. It's true. I always feel like we're right on the precipice of you not joining, but you're right. You always seem to make it, which is very, very cool. Precipice is a ding word, by the way.
And you're looking good today.
You are looking good.
You
Very professional.
Very much.
Yes.
Yeah.
I heard what the lead in, and the Remington case, the $73 million is a very interesting case. Of course, it was Sandy Hook, which was so awful. They're all awful, but God, was that one awful. They got them on a marketing claim that they had marketed the guns in a way that they could find liability and get the $73 million. But, you know, the law from 2005 means that you can't just sue them like you can sue other people. That part of what President Biden said is true, that they do have a rather unique immunity, but it was passed by Congress. And, you know, these, the idea was that if people could sue the gun manufacturers and the ammunition makers for the amount of damage that they really caused, if they could sue them for wrongful death like they sue other people, they would wipe them out of business. Whether they ought to be wiped out of business is something else that we could debate. But in rural areas, it became just toxic, the idea of the gun manufacturers being knocked out of business. So there were some very strange bedfellows who passed that law back in 2005, giving the gun manufacturers such great immunity. Adam Schiff, who's running for Senate here, voted against it, as did most people from urban areas. But Bernie Sanders famously voted for it because there he was out in Vermont. He wanted to run for Senate. You remember when Bloomberg was running in the Democratic primary, that was a key issue that he used against Sanders, including in California, that, you know, Sanders was bought and paid for by the National Rifle Association. Of course, that's not true. But the reality is it's very hard legislation to change with the Republicans in control of the House, Mark. There doesn't seem any prospect that that legislation is going to change. And so you have to find a very creative basis, like they did in the Remington case, in order to sue. You can't just they say, well, you could sue because the gun does it, you know, a normal defect, like if you buy a vacuum cleaner and it's defective. But, you know, the gun does what it's supposed to do. The shooter aims it and hits the target. It doesn't backfire, right? And so this idea that you can sue them because it's such a dangerous instrumentality, that's what you can't sue them for. And it's extremely frustrating. So the states like California, Mark, have tried to come up with ways that you can sue them, bearing in mind that there is what we call federal preemption. It was the intent of Congress to keep the manufacturers of firearms alive and not facing these huge lawsuits that would basically put them out of business. And that has preempted local laws, state laws. And that's why sometimes when these judges rule for the NRA and the gun lobby, and it's so infuriating, there is a federal law in this area that preempts a lot of the state legislation. Now, they've tried to pass laws that they're nuisances and to go after them civilly as nuisances. Those all get challenged. And then, of course, there's the famous New York pistol case from the U.S. Supreme Court that made it even harder. Because now for gun control legislation, it has to fit the historical contours of what happened back in the late 1700s and 1800s. You know, the critics say they've made these gun historians rich because they have to have experts in all these cases now. And to show you how absurd it is, there's a case right now in the U.S. Supreme Court which involves whether people who've been convicted of domestic violence or have domestic violence orders against them, like restraining orders for domestic violence, whether those people can be restricted from buying guns. And believe it or not, there are members of the Supreme Court, hopefully not a majority, who may feel that, well, wait a second, yes, back in the 1800s, unacceptable people were not allowed to have guns, but it didn't exactly fit because it wasn't domestic violence, because in those days, supposedly, we were such a patriarchy that men could beat their wife, and so there weren't very many domestic violence laws in the 1800s. Now, if they're going to engage in that kind of reasoning, facts don't matter, common sense don't matter. The gun lobby has taken over the Supreme Court and taken over the Congress. And it really is scary for things like sending your kids to school. It's really a scary world we're living in right now. But the question is, how remediable is it?
Yeah, and I just would mention this is less law and more culture. But I think, culture and the law do, and I think you've just demonstrated how, overlap each other. It used to be the NRA that everybody talked about. It's not the NRA anymore. I made this point, I think, to David Cay Johnston the other day. The NRA doesn't have a lot of money anymore. The top executive suites at the NRA, in a corrupt way, they took all the money and they used it for themselves. They built big mansions. They took expensive trips. They literally gutted the organization of millions of dollars. And so the bankruptcy of the NRA, or the teetering on the verge of bankruptcy of the NRA, is well known. What's happened is these assault weapons and these guns of all sorts, weapons of war, are becoming part of the American culture. They're becoming baked into some sort of displaced machismo, or you see Lauren Boebert has it on her Christmas card. The other Congressman Massey had it on his Christmas card. All the kids are holding assault rifles these military weapons as they pose in front of a Christmas tree. This is not just a couple of instances. There are a lot of these things going on. So I feel as though the culture of America has shifted. And so that, alongside the way that they have completely prevented us from going after these gun manufacturers, it only reinforces a gun culture in America, David.
Well, I think that you raised an excellent point, and it has become kind of a fetish.
Thank you. That's a good word.
You hope that it will pass. But, and everyone points out the commonsensical thing that you don't need these assault weapons to hunt. You don't need them for personal protection. You just don't. I mean, even the people who think that the Second Amendment allows the cases that we've had, they were basically 5-4 for hundreds of years, over 100 years. No one thought the Second Amendment gave you a right to keep or to keep arms at home, much less to bear them, to open carry them. Nobody thought. The courts didn't rule any of them until this started to happen. And there's been this revolution. Scalia and a few of the other Federalist Society justices suddenly found this right. A lot of people had thought, the courts had always thought, that it was the right to organize into militias, and those state militias organized by the government could have guns. It goes back to our whole revolutionary period, and having the muskets and fighting the redcoats and the invaders, the Brits. This idea that everybody could run around and keep and bear arms. Well, we've gone this far. It doesn't look like this Supreme Court's going to reverse Heller. So now we have not only the right to keep arms at home for self-protection to some extent, but also to bear them, which is even scarier. And it seems like that they don't summon in some of these places the police. They invade the Michigan State House, and where are the police? But some of the Republican assembly members there think it's great fun, and they think that they can intimidate their opponents with this, and they go to school board meetings. And this is what Merrick Garland, he's taken a lot of criticism over it, but this was what he was worried about with these really raucous meetings, that they're not only raucous, people screaming and using foul language and threatening people, but people are armed because they're open carry states where they're doing these things. And yes, we're at a very, very bad place, and with this Supreme Court precedent. And now, if even in a domestic violence case where someone has gotten a restraining order, you cannot bar the person from having guns. We're at a scary place.
Yeah, and I mentioned yesterday the move on the part of Tennessee and Kentucky both to do what you're talking about, to prevent red flag laws from going into effect, and prevent families and loved ones from getting guns out of the hands of those who they know will use them in awful ways. And the last thing I will just say, just because it's showing up in the chat a little bit, when it comes to, and you mentioned the word hunting. I love how hunting is. First of all, I don't get hunting. I could never pull that trigger, but that's just me. I understand. There are people who grow up with that kind of thing, but I would say you should look at what happens when an AR-15 or a military-style assault rifle is fired at a living creature. It liquefies that creature. It's not a bullet like we're used to seeing. They need to identify these kids by DNA. All right. So don't tell me, hunters, that you need these weapons to hunt. And the second thing I would say, David, is that I'm seeing this show up. What happens if you take away all these weapons and only the government has those weapons? The government will always have bigger weapons than you have. Okay, it doesn't matter how big your weapon is. They have helicopters. They have huge numbers of people that will come and get you if that's what you're worried about. So I don't get the argument in either one of those cases. But again, you hear that rolling around, and it feels as though it's a circular argument at that. And then you talk about the constituencies. You're so right to talk about that, I think. And we forget the constituencies even include Bernie Sanders sometimes when it comes to votes on gun control. So it's a sad, pathetic situation we're in.
Mark, we're so polite when it comes to this debate, from the gun control point of view. But, you're absolutely right that when the 187th Airborne shows up, it really doesn't matter that you're there with your pistol, with your rifle, or with your assault rifle. It doesn't matter at all. Of course, if you really want to be critical, the government wouldn't need to go that far. They could really cut off the government benefits that, so many of these people who are so anti-government rely on. They have their AK at home and they take it with them when they go down to get their Social Security check, their PPP check, their whatever it is. And so it really gets tiresome to hear all these people who are always against the government until, of course, they want stuff from the government. And then all the government largesse is just great as long as it's going to them and the people that they can relate to. When it's going to people that they can't relate to, then all of a sudden, how come we have this big government? How come the government's pushing us around? How come the IRS does this? How come, they do the other thing? And the idea, now I understand about the personal protection. That has been a problem. If you live like in a really bad neighborhood and the cops are scared to come out, that's one of the problems with why I don't agree with defund the police, because the police are needed in the communities of color. They're needed in the poorest communities. They get taken over by gangs. I think a lot of people who have this anti-police mentality have never lived. I lived in like in an area of New York which needed police protection. Then we moved to a better neighborhood. But I have a sense of it. And I think if people had more of a sense of it, of what it is to have a neighborhood that's really overrun by gangs and people who have illegal guns, they understand why we need the police. I'm not sure how much it really protects you to have a gun. A lot of times, Mark, if you have a gun, you just increase the level of violence. That's the reality.
The suicide rate in homes that have guns is way high, and the accidents involving guns way high. I'm not saying you shouldn't have a gun at home. I really don't care about a gun at home. I care about these caches of weapons that are. This Tennessee shooter had 7 weapons. 5 of which I believe were these military-style assault rifles. I just call them. It's a sad state, I think, that we find ourselves in, and we're unique in all the world with it. It's insanity. It's a special kind of U.S. insanity.
We are unique in the world, and these domestic violence incidents are so much more likely to end up in death or serious damage when there's guns around.
Thank you.
It's true that people sometimes, hit each other with a knife or hit each other with their hands or whatever, but it just does not escalate to the level of death or these serious injuries that we have because of guns in the house in domestic violence cases. And as you say, suicides, there's accidental shootings, kids get their hands on guns. And it's a problem that other countries, developed countries, countries that have more security than we do, they don't have this problem. They have much less of it.
I'm still going to drop a video with my friend who lives in Canada and grew up in the U.S. at different military bases where there were guns that were locked up, he says, all the time. But he says it's so weird to watch what's happening in America from Canada, because in Canada, the firearm thing is viewed as a third rail. You're not allowed to have it. Before I pivot to, I'm going to ask you quickly before we lose the great David Katz. I want to get to Gwyneth Paltrow in a second, but I have a question not related to, it's sort of just a general question. 10 of the 17 deadliest mass killings in the U.S. since 2012 involved AR-15s. In Vegas, 60 dead. Newtown, of course, we talked about it, 27 dead. Texas, 25. Uvalde, 21. Parkland, 17. San Bernardino, 14, etc. Aurora, Colorado, 12. I mean, you just go back, and this weapon is at the center of more and more of these deadliest mass killings. So now I want to talk to you about a celebrity trial. Just quickly, we understand Gwyneth Paltrow, and you were so great in explaining who had the right of way. Review just quickly. In the trial, it's about Gwyneth and this guy hitting each other on the slopes. One says, he hit me. The other says, she hit me. It's been percolating for some time. Who has the right of way? The downhill skier has the right of way, right?
Right. So you've got to not hit the person below you. Just like in a car, you've got to not hit the person in front of you.
Okay.
And
so here's my question, though. We were talking about it the other day. She's turned down the glam, right? I mean, you're not seeing the red carpet Gwyneth Paltrow. You're seeing the, courtroom Gwyneth Paltrow. And that's clearly because, I mean, historically, it must be bad to be, a shimmering celebrity client. I mean, it just doesn't engender you in any kind of positive way with the jury. But I want to ask you, a celebrity client generally, is that a good thing to have as an attorney? Would you like to be defending a celebrity client in this case? There she is. Or would you prefer it just be an every person client?
Well, let's not make this short. This is an interesting topic. We're always... Your commenters say Katz is always giving us bad news because we're talking about the intractable U.S. Supreme Court majority of 6-3, or we're talking about trying to do something about the gun laws, which is so infuriating, and you feel like it's so futile sometimes, but people shouldn't. We have to just always keep organizing, voting, trying to make a difference, changing the world for the better. But it's so funny what you asked, because Martha Stewart, when she was on trial and she got convicted of insider trading, they asked the jurors afterwards, so what'd you think of the evidence? What'd you think of the lawyers? And what they remembered was that she had a $10,000 purse. So you have to, if you're a criminal defense attorney or a plaintiff's lawyer, defense lawyer, you have to always think, how is the jury relating to your client? Don't have your client wear a huge Rolex watch. But if they are a celebrity, they are a celebrity. The criminal defense lawyers who tell you, I wouldn't have represented OJ, they didn't get the call to represent OJ. So I think a lot of this, if you're a criminal defense attorney or you're an attorney, you want to do the most interesting case that comes to you. You want it to obviously pay your bills. One of the other great stories, Mark, was a famous female actress said about her famous attorney. She said, he believes in my case so much, he's not even charging me a fee. And of course, she was trying to be, trying to show how much he believed in her, what altruism. Of course, the insiders, the lawyers all said, my God, his practice must be slow that he'd take that case for no money. And who even knew if that was true or not? So you have a level. I represented, like I said, I've never represented anyone as famous as Paltrow, but I do a lot of these criminal tax defenses. And so I've had people, major business people. I've had all kinds of entrepreneurs and stuff like that. But I also had America's favorite porn star about 20 years ago, who was alleged not to have paid a whole bunch of her taxes. We'll call her Susie.
Susie, okay. Susie was America's favorite.
Susie. Okay. I was still a professor in those days when I won her case. So my students, when I met with the class again after that, had written on the board in huge letters, Professor Katz got Susie off. So not exactly a headline I could put up in my office. So
it was great. I loved it.
A lot of strange things happened with celebrities. Can I tell you one more story? Since
Please.
It's baseball's opening day. One of my famous cases when I was still an assistant U.S. attorney prosecuting cases was we had a tax shelter. And two of my witnesses, who were purely witnesses, they had nothing to do with any of the criminality. They were just used by the tax shelter scammers to make videotapes or audio tapes that they were then going to market and claim they were hugely valuable. And then they were going to give the investors these big tax write-offs, big tax credits that they could put on their tax return and save more money than they put into the scheme. So Tommy Lasorda and Vincent Price were my star witnesses.
Oh, that's very cool.
So the defendants were left to argue that the tapes had been made in like 1983, when in fact they'd been made they'd been made in 82, which was the year they were giving the tax benefit for, Mark, when in fact they'd been made in 83. So they had to backdate the documents. So I needed to call Tommy and Vincent Price to the stand in federal court. By now it was 1989 when the case was being tried. Vincent Price had the Thriller, the great
sure, yeah,
that he did around Halloween. I always think of him because you hear it all the time, the Michael Jackson song on the radio with his fantastic voice over in it. And of course, Tommy Lasorda had won the World Series with the famous Kirk Gibson home run World Series in 1988. Right. So they did not want to be bothered with this case from 1982-83, but they had to be. So I had to call Tommy to the stand. The defendant wanted to go to trial because he had to try to leave the jury with the impression that maybe Tommy had walked around with his check from the time he made the tape in December 82. He'd walked around with it for a month or two. So I had Tommy Lasorda on the stand. This is when we still had a tabloid in LA, so they were covering this case, breathlessly. And I said to Tommy, are you sure you didn't walk around with that check? Maybe you walked around with it in your wallet for a month or two. Tommy says, I hammer my checks. I said, it just came to me. I said, even your Dodger check? He says, I hammer my Dodger check. So, of course, that was the headline the next day. So whenever you're involved with celebrities, weird things happen, right? Because the world is so interested. Generally speaking, word of wisdom to anyone who's a lawyer or going to be a lawyer in your audience, keep your client out of the papers in a criminal case. It almost never helps. It may help the attorney try to get business, but it almost never helps the client, because even if your client gets acquitted, a lot of people think, oh, well, he's just some rich guy. He paid cats, he got off, but it was because he had money. A lot of people, even when they see you're found not guilty, don't think you're not guilty. They think somehow you played the system, you had a great lawyer, there was some technicality. Keep your client out of the media if you're the lawyer.
Yeah, that's a great point. And the media is always going to cherry pick testimony. And when they report the court case, you're getting a slight little bit of what actually went on in the courtroom. You make such a good point that way. Well, David, some good news. Well, I don't know, good news, but neither good nor bad on the celebrity case. And then, of course, it's just all bad when it comes to assault weapons and this country and the law. I mean, the reality is you can't sue unless something went wrong with the weapon. I mean, it seems like, that's just in itself.
Find something clever like the marketing thing. This is really a case for good lawyering. And a lot of the big firms now are taking these cases. It's not just the gun manufacturers that have great lawyers. There's some great lawyers facing them. And they need to keep trying. And of course, the legislatures need to keep trying. And in this state, we're trying. The governor just had this idea, since Texas was going to pay a ransom to a $10,000 ransom for ratting on somebody. Governor Newsom said, turnabout is fair play. Why don't we have that with people who violate the gun laws? You ought to be able to go snitch on them. I don't like the idea, but I get where he was coming from. And especially if the courts say it's legal and they want to fight that hard. Every abortion in Texas, why not fight that hard in California? Every use or possession of an illegal weapon here. There are laws against guns. There's waiting periods. There are people who are not allowed to have guns. We still have this very vigorous enforcement when it comes to domestic violence, restraining orders. You can't have a gun. And so we need to enforce those laws. And if someone finds out that the law is not being enforced and they inform on somebody, they have this law, at least for the moment, where they get the...
For the moment. I mean, the California law is being challenged at the federal level as well, as you know. So it's just, it's a tough spot. I was going to say, I love that you say, but you got to fight for it. You got to keep the fight up. Out of time, David, thank you. Albert, from now on, I want David, we can try to hook him up a few minutes ahead of time so we get him on time. Don't you think?
That wasn't Albert's fault today. That was my fault today.
Don't ever say it wasn't Albert's fault. It's all
whoever is producing this thing has no idea what they're doing.
What a lame excuse, but there just were no parking spots.
That's all right. It's great to have you on. Good to talk to you, Dave. We'll talk next week. Thanks, David Katz. Yeah.
The Mark Thompson Show.
I got to clip that, Mark. Every time we get David, I'm going to clip that. Yeah.
Hi, it's Mark, and I thought that was great. Hit the notification bell. You'll know whenever there's a new video being dropped, and please subscribe to our channel to help us save the universe.